What if the USSR joined the Korean War? But before we have complete Soviet open involvement in the intervention in the war, we need some context as to what actual Soviet intervention there was in Korea, as well as how and when we can expand it. After secretly crossing the Yalu River on October 19, 1950, the PVA's 13th Army Group launched the first phase of the offensive on October 25th, attacking the advancing UN forces near the Sino-Korean border. This military decision made solely by China changed the attitude of the Soviet Union. 12 days after PVA troops entered the war, Stalin allowed the Soviet Air Force to provide air cover and support and more aid to China. This increased Soviet aid included weapons and equipment, as well as Soviet pilots of the 64th Aviation Corps, who were active in Korea from November 1950 onwards. In order to hide this direct Soviet intervention, precautions were taken to disguise their involvement, open knowledge of which would have been a major diplomatic embarrassment for the USSR. Soviet pilots flying MiG-15 jets participated in battles around the Yalu River on the Chinese-Korean border in an area which was known as MiG Alley, and operations against the UN's train-busting attacks in northern Korea was also considered very successful by the Soviet planners. Additionally, before launching their offensive in 1950, the Chinese had been negotiating with the Soviets for a March offensive in 1951 with both forces. However, this agreement fell apart as the Soviets did not want to directly intervene in the Korean War. Soviet intervention could be possible in three different scenarios which result in three different outcomes. Number one is where China doesn't join the war and the USSR invades instead of China. Number two is the USSR intervenes with China in 1950. Or, number three, the USSR intervenes during the stalemate from 1951 to 53 in Korea. Scenario 1 is highly unlikely, but in this case, the USSR intervenes in March 1951 and would not be as effective as the Chinese due to the war having virtually ended by that time. It would also be viewed as a last-ditch effort by the Soviets to stop reunification in Korea and have the Soviets and Chinese see each other as very unreliable allies, since the Chinese did not intervene in the war and the Soviets did so, but it turned out horrible for them. This would likely lead to a loss in global credibility for the Soviet Union as they attempted to change the results of a war at the last minute by trying to start World War III. Combined with the previous Berlin blockade, the Third World is less likely to see the Soviets as a friendly state. Scenario 2 is more likely and sees Stalin agree to full commitment of Soviet forces into North Korea with the Chinese. Two sub-scenarios could spawn. One is where China attacks and the Soviets come in March, and two is where the Soviets come into a joint offensive with the Chinese if China agrees to wait until March of 1951 for the offensive. In a March Sino-Soviet offensive, the Korean War was essentially over, but the Communist forces would overwhelm the remaining UN troops. Korea sees mass escalation in early 1951, which furthers the idea of the wrong war, wrong place, and wrong time. The UN matches Sino-Soviet aggression and widens the war. This offensive would lead to a larger communist invasion throughout Korea, and the war is widened when nobody wanted it. General Douglas MacArthur might remain Supreme Allied Commander to keep troop morale higher, and nuclear weapons would definitely remain on the table as Soviets already came into the war. If China invaded and then the USSR came in March, it would have been seen as a hasty escalation by communist forces. Sure, the stalemate would have been broken with Soviet support in 1951, but the communist forces would have great consequences as Truman would consider the nuclear option to be more viable at this time. Scenario 3 would most likely involve heavy Soviet air support in the bombing of South Korea. The UN responds with more bombings of North Korea, what's left of it, and the communist forces that are there. The Soviets respond by bombing Japan, and in retaliation, the UN then does some bombings in China. You get the picture. Consequences of Scenario 3 would be that the world is quickly heading down an escalatory retaliation path towards World War III. I don't think that widening the war in Korea could lead to World War III because it would be irrational, but lots of countries are headed by idiots. The US has nukes. The USSR and Chinese have more manpower that they would be willing to sacrifice, and both feel completely justified in whatever action they take. Let's just say this definitely wouldn't end well for anybody. What do you think would have happened had the Soviet Union fully joined the Korean War, and what would be the effects of it? Which of these three scenarios presented did you think was most plausible? Let me know in the comments, and thank you for watching.